camera opens on a man in uniform, head lowered, voice trembling. No gunfire, no sirens, just a confession. And in that quiet moment, a chilling truth emerges: the most dangerous threats to a nation don't always come from across its borders. Sometimes they come from the very people sworn to protect it. Tonight's story is not rumor, speculation, or political theater. It is the sworn testimony of soldiers who admit they were recruited to assassinate Ibrahim Traore, to plant explosives inside government buildings, and to plunge Burkina Faso into chaos in a single coordinated night. The language is plain, the details are precise, the remorse is unmistakable, and the implications are staggering. Picture the setting: a country already fighting terrorism, already stretched thin, already carrying the scars of past instability. Now imagine learning that the very unit entrusted with guarding the head of state had been infiltrated, turned weaponized against its own commander-in-chief. This was not a sloppy plot. It was methodical, compartmentalized, financed, directed through encrypted channels, timed to the minute. The goal was not merely to remove a leader, but to decapitate an entire government in one swift blow. For Americans watching from afar, this may sound like a distant crisis, but the questions it raises are uncomfortably familiar. What happens when reform threatens entrenched interests? When a leader moves to reclaim national resources, expel foreign forces, and chart an independent path? Who benefits if that leader falls, and who is willing to pay, recruit, and conspire to make sure he does? As we begin, listen carefully, not just to what is said, but to what it reveals about power, betrayal, and the price of sovereignty in the modern world. This is not just about one man under threat. It is about whether a nation can defend its future when the knives are already inside the room. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reform agenda can survive this level of internal betrayal? Can a country remain sovereign when its protectors are being turned into assassins? Please share this video if you believe the truth matters more than headlines, and subscribe if you think Africa's future deserves to be understood, not ignored. It began quietly, almost insignificantly, the way many acts of betrayal do, not with gunfire or explosions, but with missed phone calls. An unknown number rang repeatedly. The soldier did not answer. Then a familiar voice intervened, an uncle, a merchant by trade, someone trusted, someone ordinary. He urged him to pick up the call. "It's a friend," he said. "A legal matter." Nothing sounded dangerous. Nothing felt like treason. And that is precisely how the door first opened. When the connection was finally made, the conversation avoided direct language. No one said coup, no one said assassination. Instead, there were coded pleasantries, questions about morale, about whether everything was fine over there. Then came the revelation of identity. The voice on the line belonged to Paul-Henri Damiba, a former leader of Burkina Faso, speaking not from within the nation, but from abroad. Respect was exchanged. The call ended. And yet something irreversible had already begun. Days later, contact resumed. This time the message was clearer, still indirect, but unmistakable. There was a task. There would be a commission. An adjutant would provide details. The soldier did not object. He did not ask questions. In his own words, he accepted without saying anything. That silence mattered. It marked the moment when loyalty began to shift, when obedience to the uniform was quietly replaced by obedience to a hidden chain of command. The plan advanced step by step. Meetings were arranged in plain sight, at offices, at familiar locations, at times that raised no suspicion. Weapons were prepared: 2 PKM machine guns, boxes of ammunition, vehicles ready for movement. These were not symbolic gestures. They were practical preparations for violence. The mission was not abstract. It was operational. What makes this phase of the story especially unsettling is who was involved. This was not an outsider smuggled in from across a border. This was a sergeant major of the Republican Guard, the elite unit sworn to protect the head of state. A man entrusted with proximity, access, and authority. According to his confession, he had already begun mobilizing his most trusted men, drawing from the very ranks meant to shield Ibrahim Traore from harm. The objective soon became explicit. He was ordered to plant mines inside a government building where senior officials routinely met. The intention was clear: maximum casualties, a single strike designed to wipe out Burkina Faso's leadership in one night. This was not a protest, not pressure, not political rivalry. It was a plan for mass killing. Money changed hands. Packages were collected discreetly. When one package was finally opened, it contained millions in cash, 8 million CFA francs. Some of it was distributed, some of it was held back. The flow of funds was deliberate, controlled, and consistent with a larger operation rather than a lone actor's desperation. Every detail reinforced the same conclusion: this was organized, financed, and coordinated far beyond the capacity of one disgruntled soldier. The timeline converged on a single date, January 3, 2026, around 11 p.m., late enough for silence, late enough for confusion, late enough for shock to spread before anyone could respond. The soldier went to the designated location with weapons and ammunition, waiting for final instructions, waiting for confirmation from his handlers. And then, unexpectedly, the plan unraveled. Arrests were made. The network began to crack. Confessions followed. Standing before the nation, the soldier did not deny his role. He apologized to the president, to the military hierarchy, to the people. He asked for clemency again and again. But by then, the damage was already done, because what his confession revealed was not just a failed plot, but the terrifying ease with which betrayal had been planted at the heart of the state. Do you agree with this section's content and pacing? I will only continue to Task 3, Climax and Reactions, once you confirm. The moment the first confession aired, the nation held its breath. But it was the pattern that followed the repetition, the echoes across testimonies that pushed this story to its breaking point. One by one, soldiers stepped forward, different ranks, different units, different paths into the conspiracy, yet each confession circled the same center, naming the same architect, describing the same method. What had begun as a single act of betrayal was now unmistakably a coordinated campaign. By the time Sergeant Major Salo Yalwego spoke, the scale was impossible to ignore. He did not describe confusion or coercion, he described preparation. He admitted to mobilizing trusted men. He admitted to carrying 2 PKM machine guns and multiple boxes of ammunition. He admitted to plans to plant mines inside a government building where leaders regularly convened. The intent was no longer ambiguous. This was a blueprint for mass casualties, an attempt to decapitate the state in a single catastrophic strike. Then came the revelations that shifted fear into alarm: the communications. The conspirators were not using ordinary calls or messages. They were instructed to operate through encrypted platforms, Signal and Zongi tools favored by professional intelligence services. Messages were set to disappear within seconds or minutes. Instructions were delivered in parables and coded phrases. Even the act of checking in was stripped of language, reduced to silence and timing. This was operational security, not improvisation. Another confessor, Captain Prosper Kudati, filled in the missing pieces. He testified that he was contacted directly by Paul-Henri Damiba, operating from outside Burkina Faso. To ensure secrecy, intermediaries were used. On Signal, messages passed through a figure known as King David, later identified as Captain Adogo David, reportedly hiding in Ghana. On Zongi, messages self-destructed if left unread for 10 minutes. The system was layered, paranoid, and deliberately compartmentalized. At the heart of the plot lay a strategic objective that revealed just how calculated this operation truly was: the Sapui drone base. According to testimony, the order was delivered in chilling code: cut off the pastor's head. The pastor was Captain Pacer, the base commander. The meaning was clear: remove the commander, disable the drones, and blind the military. Without aerial surveillance, troop movements could proceed unseen. Resistance could be overwhelmed before it could organize. The coup would unfold in darkness. The attack was scheduled with precision. January 3, 2026, 11 o'clock at night. A synchronized strike, assassination, sabotage, and seizure designed to collapse leadership and command simultaneously. And crucially, the structure ensured survivability. Each cell knew only its task. Only one man reportedly held the full picture. If one group failed, the others could still proceed. It was a classic insurgent model, refined and ruthless. As these details emerged, reactions rippled outward. Inside Burkina Faso, the shock was visceral. The Republican Guard symbols of protection and loyalty had been infiltrated, trust fractured. Families listened in silence as apologies were delivered on national television. Soldiers asked themselves who they could still rely on. Civilians confronted a terrifying realization: the danger had been closer than anyone imagined. Beyond the borders, the implications were impossible to ignore. The sophistication of the operation raised uncomfortable questions about support and funding, encrypted communications, cash payments totaling millions, logistics for weapons and explosives, safe movement across borders. This was not the work of a man acting alone from exile. The resources required pointed toward backing, whether direct or indirect, that extended beyond personal networks. Standing before the cameras, the confessor pleaded for clemency from Ibrahim Traore, from the military hierarchy, from the people. His voice cracked. He repeated his apology. But the nation was no longer listening for remorse. It was listening for answers. Because what had been exposed was not just a failed coup, it was a warning, a demonstration of how modern power struggles are waged quietly, digitally, and from afar until the final moment of violence. Do you agree with this section's content and emotional pacing? I will only continue to task 4, civil and political consequences, once you confirm. When the confessions ended, the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. In homes across Burkina Faso, families sat still, absorbing what they had just heard. This was not a rumor spreading through markets or a headline flashing across phones. It was a sworn admission broadcast to the nation that the people closest to power had nearly turned the state into a graveyard. The first consequence was psychological, and it landed immediately. For ordinary citizens, the realization was deeply unsettling. The Republican Guard was not just another military unit, it was the symbol of protection around the presidency, the visible assurance that the state could defend itself. Learning that members of this elite force had been mobilized for assassination and mass killing shattered a basic sense of safety. Parents asked whether their children were truly protected. Shopkeepers wondered if stability was an illusion. Even daily routines, commutes, meetings, public gatherings felt suddenly fragile. Inside the armed forces, the impact was even more severe. Trust is the backbone of any military, and that trust had been pierced. Units were forced to reassess internal loyalties. Commanders reviewed rosters not just for competence, but for allegiance. The confessions introduced a quiet, corrosive doubt. Who else had been approached, who else had remained silent, and who else might still be waiting for a call that would never come? Morale did not collapse, but it hardened into vigilance, suspicion, and resolve. Politically, the consequences moved just as quickly. The government could no longer treat this as an isolated breach. The repeated appearance of the same name across multiple testimonies transformed the narrative from rogue actors into an alleged conspiracy directed by Paul-Henri Damiba, a former head of state now operating from exile. That shift mattered. It reframed the crisis as a continuation of unfinished power struggles rather than a sudden breakdown of discipline. For Ibrahim Traore, the political stakes intensified overnight. His leadership had already drawn criticism and praise for confronting entrenched systems, reforming security structures, asserting national control over resources, and distancing the country from foreign military dependence. Now, the attempted coup gave those policies a new gravity. Reform was no longer abstract or ideological, it was existential. Public reaction reflected this shift. Rather than panic, many citizens responded with defiance. Statements of apology from the conspirators were met not with celebration, but with sober reflection. The question was no longer whether forgiveness should be granted, but whether the state could be protected from repetition. Calls grew louder for accountability, restructuring, and vigilance. Civil society groups demanded clarity. Families of soldiers demanded reassurance. The nation demanded guarantees. There were also human consequences for the accused, and their families often overlooked but deeply felt. Shame spread outward from the confessions, touching relatives who had no role in the plot yet bore its weight. Communities wrestled with conflicting emotions, anger at betrayal, sorrow for wasted lives, and fear of what might come next. The apologies, repeated again and again, underscored a tragic truth. Many of the men involved seemed to realize the magnitude of their actions only after the machinery of the state closed in. Above all, the crisis forced Burkina Faso to confront a hard reality. Modern destabilization does not always arrive with foreign troops or loud ultimatums. It arrives quietly through phones, money, and trusted faces. The civil and political consequence of this failed coup was a nation awakened, not reassured, not comforted, but alert. The social fabric did not tear, but it tightened, pulling citizens and institutions into a shared understanding that sovereignty must be defended not just at borders, but within ranks and relationships. Do you agree with this section's focus and tone? I will only continue to Task 5, U.S. and Global Perspective, once you confirm. From Washington to Brussels, the revelations out of Burkina Faso landed with quiet concern rather than surprise. For policymakers who track West Africa closely, the attempted coup followed a familiar pattern, one that has repeated itself whenever a government challenges established security arrangements, resource contracts, or geopolitical alignments. What stood out this time was not merely the intent, but the sophistication. To American analysts, the use of encrypted platforms, disappearing messages, intermediaries, and compartmentalized cells reads like a case study in modern covert operations. This was not the chaotic improvisation of disgruntled officers. It resembled the disciplined tradecraft taught, refined, and exported over decades of global intelligence competition. That reality forces an uncomfortable question for the United States and its allies when instability erupts in the Sahel: who benefits and who quietly loses leverage. Over the past 2 years, Ibrahim Traore has pursued a course that diverges sharply from Western preferences. He has reduced reliance on foreign military deployments, tightened control over strategic resources, and aligned regionally with Mali and Niger to form a bloc focused on collective sovereignty. To supporters, this represents overdue self-determination. To critics, it threatens counterterrorism coordination and long-standing influence built through security partnerships. From a U.S. perspective, the stakes are not ideological alone. The Sahel sits at the crossroads of terrorism, migration routes, and mineral supply chains vital to global markets. Washington has long argued that stability requires cooperation, predictability, and alignment with international norms. But the events described in these confessions suggest a deeper tension: stability imposed from outside versus stability built from within. When those two visions collide, pressure follows. European capitals view the situation through a similar lens, shaped by recent withdrawals and recalibrations across Francophone Africa. The erosion of traditional influence has left gaps: security gaps, intelligence gaps, and trust gaps. In those spaces, alternative partnerships emerge. Some in the West fear that a sovereign Sahel will drift toward rivals. Others quietly acknowledge that the old model has failed, breeding resentment without delivering security. For American audiences, the parallels are worth considering. History shows that when leaders move to reclaim national control over resources, borders, or policy, the backlash rarely announces itself openly. It operates indirectly through funding channels, deniable networks, and internal crises that carry external fingerprints. The question is not whether foreign hands are always present, but whether global systems unintentionally incentivize destabilization when reform threatens entrenched interests. At the United Nations and in diplomatic briefings, language remains cautious. No formal accusations, no public condemnations. Yet the silence itself is telling. Governments understand that overt reactions can harden positions or legitimize claims they would rather keep ambiguous. Meanwhile, intelligence communities quietly reassess assumptions about who holds influence in West Africa and how quickly it can erode. What this moment ultimately reveals is a broader shift. The world is entering an era where African nations are no longer content to play assigned roles. As they test new paths, resistance, overt or covert, becomes part of the landscape. For the United States, the choice ahead is not simply whether to support or oppose leaders like Traore, but whether to engage a changing Africa on its own terms. Do you agree with this global framing and U.S. perspective? I will only continue to Task 6, conclusion and final CTA, once you confirm. As the final confession fades and the cameras turn away, what remains is not relief, but a warning. The failed plot against Ibrahim Traore was stopped in time, yet its significance stretches far beyond one night, one city, or one leader. It exposed a truth that many nations eventually confront: sovereignty is not only threatened by enemies at the gate, but by quiet compromises within the walls. For Burkina Faso, this moment marks a turning point. The country has not collapsed. The institutions did not dissolve. Instead, the nation absorbed the shock and remained standing. That resilience matters. But resilience alone is not enough. What these confessions reveal is how modern destabilization works, how power is challenged, not through declarations of war, but through phones, money-coded language, and trusted faces slowly turned against their own people. This is where the lesson broadens. Around the world, from Latin America to Africa, to parts of Eastern Europe, leaders who attempt to break from old dependency structures often face resistance that wears the mask of internal crisis. The pattern is familiar. Discontent is amplified, loyalty is tested, and violence is outsourced to plausible deniability. When it fails, it is labeled an internal problem. When it succeeds, it is quietly accepted as a change of leadership. For Americans watching this story, the distance can feel reassuring, but it should not. The core questions raised here are universal. Can reform survive when entrenched interests feel threatened? Can a nation protect itself when the line between foreign pressure and domestic betrayal becomes deliberately blurred? And how should the international community respond when stability and sovereignty appear to be in tension? The future of Burkina Faso will not be decided by one confession or one failed coup. It will be shaped by what follows, whether accountability replaces silence, whether vigilance replaces complacency, and whether unity outlasts fear. For President Ibrahim Traore, the challenge ahead is immense, not just to govern, but to govern, while knowing that the danger did not disappear with the arrests. It simply adapted. For the rest of the world, this episode should prompt reflection rather than judgment. Africa is changing. Its leaders are testing new paths. Some will succeed, some will fail. But the era of unquestioned influence, quiet control, and predictable outcomes is clearly fading. What replaces it will depend on whether nations are allowed to choose their futures without coercion, overt or hidden. So we leave you with these questions. Do you think President Ibrahim Traore's national reform strategies are truly effective, yet can we continue to trust his leadership, or should Burkina Faso seek a different path forward? Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to recognize what is truly at stake in Africa today. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines and that understanding matters more than indifference.